My stepmother announced she was cutting me from Dad's will at the reading. The lawyer started laughing. I'm Jovi, and that moment, sitting in that mahogany-paneled conference room at Henderson and Associates downtown Chicago, changed my life forever. But not in the way anyone expected. Let me back up 6 months. Dad had just passed after a brutal fight with pancreatic cancer. Richard Blackwood, my father, had built Blackwood Construction from nothing into a multi-million-dollar empire. Skyscrapers across the Midwest bore his company's name. He was tough as Chicago steel, but he loved me fiercely, his only child from his first marriage to my mother, who died when I was 12. Then came Veronica. Dad married her 3 years ago when I was 25. She was everything my mother wasn't, flashy young, obsessed with appearances. A former Instagram influencer who somehow convinced my grieving father she was his soulmate. I saw right through her Botox and designer handbags, but Dad was smitten. The day of the will reading, I drove my beat-up Honda Civic to the glass tower housing Henderson and Associates. I'd been working as a social worker, making barely enough to cover my student loans and rent for my studio apartment in Lincoln Park. Dad had always promised me that his legacy would be mine, not just the money, but the responsibility to carry on what he'd built. Veronica arrived in Dad's black Bentley, wearing a Chanel suit that probably cost more than I made in 3 months. She swept into the conference room like she owned it, her platinum blonde hair perfectly styled, her smile sharp as a knife. Mr. Henderson, Dad's longtime attorney, seemed nervous. He'd known me since I was a kid, had watched Dad beam with pride when I graduated from Northwestern. His hands shook slightly as he opened the leather portfolio containing Dad's final wishes. Before we begin, Veronica interrupted, her voice dripping with false sweetness, I need to address something. She turned to me with those cold blue eyes. Jovi, honey, I'm afraid your father changed his mind about some things before he passed. You're no longer included in the primary inheritance. The words hit me like a sledgehammer. The room spun. What are you talking about? The company, the houses, the investments, they're all coming to me. Richard realized I was the one who truly understood his vision for the future. Her smile widened. You'll receive a small trust fund, of course. Enough for a nice car, maybe. I looked at Mr. Henderson, desperate for him to contradict her. Instead, he did something completely unexpected. He started laughing. Not a chuckle. Not a polite cough. A deep, genuine belly laugh that echoed off the conference room walls. Tears streamed down his weathered face as he clutched his sides. I'm sorry, he gasped between fits of laughter. I'm so very sorry, but this is just too perfect. Veronica's confident expression cracked. What's so funny, Harold? Mr. Henderson wiped his eyes and straightened his tie. Mrs. Blackwood, you seem to be under a significant misunderstanding about the contents of this will. My heart hammered against my ribs. What was happening? Veronica, Mr. Henderson said, his laughter subsiding into an amused smile, you've just announced something that's entirely incorrect. In fact, it's so far from the truth that I'm wondering where you got such an idea. The color drained from my stepmother's perfectly made-up face. What do you mean? Richard told me. Richard told you what you wanted to hear, I suspect. Henderson opened the will with steady hands. But his actual final wishes tell a very different story. I gripped the arms of my chair, afraid to hope. Dad had been acting strange those last few weeks before he died. Secretive phone calls, meetings with Henderson that Veronica wasn't invited to, knowing looks when he thought she wasn't watching. Let me read the relevant portions, Henderson continued. To my beloved daughter Jovi Blackwood, who has shown me what true character looks like through her work helping others, I leave the entirety of Blackwood Construction, all real estate holdings, investment portfolios, and personal assets. She alone has demonstrated the values I built this company on. The silence in the room was deafening. Veronica's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. That's impossible, she whispered. He promised me. Did he? Henderson's eyebrows raised. Because according to this will, drafted 6 weeks before his death and witnessed by 3 independent parties, Veronica Blackwood receives exactly what she brought into this marriage, nothing. My hands trembled as the magnitude hit me. Everything. Dad had left me everything. But Henderson wasn't finished. There's more. Richard was quite specific about his reasoning. He adjusted his glasses and continued reading. I have discovered certain activities that have convinced me my second wife married me under false pretenses. Veronica shot to her feet. This is ridiculous. I'll contest it. I'll... Sit down, Veronica. Henderson's voice carried an authority I'd never heard before. You'll want to hear this next part. She remained standing, her hands clenched into fists. Your father, Henderson said to me, hired a private investigator 3 months before his death. What they discovered about Veronica's activities during your father's illness was illuminating. The investigator had photos, financial records, text messages. While Dad was fighting for his life in chemotherapy, Veronica had been planning her future, with someone else. A personal trainer named Brad Kingsley who she'd been seeing for 8 months. They'd already looked at condos in Miami, discussed what they'd do with Dad's money once he was gone. The prenup you signed, Veronica, was ironclad. Adultery voids any claim to Richard's estate. Veronica's face had gone from pale to green. You can't prove anything. Henderson slid a manila envelope across the table. Photos of you and Mr. Kingsley at the Fairmont Hotel. Credit card receipts for the jewelry you bought him. Bank records showing the $50,000 you transferred to his account last month. Should I continue? I stared at this woman who had sat beside Dad's hospital bed, holding his hand while he struggled to breathe, all while betraying him in the cruelest way possible. Get out, I said quietly. Jovi, you don't understand. Get out. The words erupted from somewhere deep inside me, carrying months of suppressed anger and grief. But Veronica wasn't done fighting. As Henderson explained the next steps, the transfer of assets, the company transition, the various properties I now owned, she stood in the corner making frantic phone calls. I caught fragments, contingency plan, what we discussed, it's time. A chill ran down my spine. What contingency plan? 3 days after the will reading, I was standing in the executive office of Blackwood Construction, my office now, when my assistant knocked urgently. Ms. Blackwood, there are federal agents here to see you. 2 FBI agents in dark suits entered, their expressions grim. Agent Roberts, a woman about my age with sharp eyes, spoke first. Jovi Blackwood, we need to discuss some irregularities in your father's business dealings. My blood turned to ice. What kind of irregularities? Tax evasion, money laundering, fraud. We've received credible information suggesting Blackwood Construction has been involved in criminal activities for years. Agent Morrison, her partner, placed a thick file on my desk. We've been building this case for months. The source came forward just this week with detailed evidence. I didn't need to ask who the source was. Veronica's smug face appeared in my mind. This is insane. My father built this company honestly. He was the most ethical man I knew. The evidence suggests otherwise, Roberts said. Shell companies, unreported income, payments to offshore accounts. If these allegations prove true, the government will seize all assets pending investigation. Everything Dad had worked for, everything he'd left me, could vanish. Worse, his reputation, the thing he'd valued most, would be destroyed. I want to see this evidence. Morrison opened the file. Financial documents, bank statements, incorporation papers for companies I'd never heard of. At first glance, it looked legitimate. Too legitimate. Where did you get these? A concerned party brought them to our attention. Someone with intimate knowledge of the company's operations. That evening, I called Henderson in a panic. Can they do this? Can they just take everything based on Veronica's lies? If the evidence is fabricated, we can fight it. But Jovi, these investigations can take years. And the damage to the company's reputation. He didn't need to finish. I spent that night in Dad's study, now mine, surrounded by his real financial records. Dad had been meticulous, keeping detailed files of every transaction, every deal, every penny that flowed through Blackwood Construction. That's when I found it. Hidden in a secret compartment behind his awards display was a folder labeled Insurance Policy. Inside were documents that made my heart race, copies of everything Veronica had hidden, evidence of her affair, but more importantly, records showing Dad had suspected her scheme all along. He'd been gathering evidence of his own. But there was something else. Bank records showing large payments from Blackwood Construction to a company called Apex Holdings. Payments that started right after Dad married Veronica. I'd never heard of Apex Holdings. I spent the rest of the night digging through corporate records online. Apex Holdings was registered in Delaware, owned by a shell company, which was owned by another shell company. It took me hours to trace the ownership chain. The final owner made my blood run cold, Brad Kingsley. Veronica's lover. Dad hadn't just discovered their affair. He discovered they'd been stealing from him for 2 years, funneling money through fake contracts and inflated invoices. The evidence the FBI had wasn't fabricated, it was selectively edited to make Dad look like the criminal instead of the victim. But now I had the real story. The question was, how could I prove it before Veronica and Brad disappeared with millions of dollars? As dawn broke over Chicago, I realized Dad's final gift wasn't just his company. It was the chance to catch the people who'd betrayed him. The hunt was on. I couldn't trust anyone. If Veronica had FBI contacts willing to act on fabricated evidence, she had resources I hadn't imagined. So I did what Dad would have done. I got creative. My first call was to Danny Rodriguez, Dad's former head of security who'd retired 6 months ago. Danny had worked for the Chicago PD for 20 years before Dad hired him. If anyone could help me navigate this mess without alerting the wrong people, it was him. Danny, it's Jovi. I need your help, and I need you to not ask questions until I explain everything. 3 hours later, we met at Murphy's Diner on the south side, far from downtown and prying eyes. Danny's weathered face grew darker as I explained what I'd discovered. Your dad suspected something, he said finally. Asked me to do some quiet digging on Veronica about 4 months ago. I found the affair, gave him photos, but he told me to keep looking. Did you find the financial stuff? Started to. Then I got sick, that heart attack, and had to retire. But I kept copies of everything I'd gathered. He slid a flash drive across the table. Your dad made me promise to give this to you if anything happened to him. The flash drive contained a treasure trove, surveillance footage of Veronica and Brad meeting with unknown men in expensive suits, photos of documents being exchanged, records of wire transfers that coincided with major Blackwood construction projects. Who are these men? I asked, studying the photos. That one's Tommy Marchetti, Danny pointed to a silver-haired man in the surveillance photos. He runs a construction company that bids against Blackwood on city projects. Always loses, but lately he's been winning more. The pieces clicked into place. This wasn't just about stealing money, it was about sabotaging Dad's business from the inside. But we needed more evidence. Real, court-admissible proof that would clear Dad's name and expose the conspiracy. Danny, how do you feel about some old-fashioned detective work? Over the next week, we launched our own investigation. Danny used his police contacts to track Veronica and Brad's movements. I dug deeper into the financial records, building a timeline of the thefts. The pattern was sophisticated. Veronica would learn about upcoming Blackwood bids from Dad's dinner conversations. Brad would pass that information to Marchetti, who could then underbid by just enough to win contracts. Meanwhile, fake invoices from Apex Holdings bled money from legitimate Blackwood projects to fund their scheme. But the FBI investigation was moving fast. Agent Roberts called daily with new evidence of Dad's supposed crimes. I played dumb, pretending to be a confused daughter overwhelmed by inheriting a corrupt empire. The breakthrough came on Thursday night. Danny had been watching Brad's apartment when he saw him loading suitcases into a rental car. They're running, Danny called me. Tonight. I met him outside Brad's building in Streeterville. Through binoculars, we watched as Veronica arrived in a taxi, dragging designer luggage. We need to see where they're going, I said. Following them through Chicago traffic in Danny's old Crown Victoria, we watched them drive to a private airfield outside the city. A small jet sat on the tarmac, engines warming up. Once they're on that plane, we'll never see them again, Danny muttered. That's when I spotted him, Tommy Marchetti, emerging from a black SUV with 2 other men. One carried a metal briefcase. Danny, are you recording this? Every second. We watched as Marchetti handed Brad the briefcase, payment for services rendered, no doubt. Veronica kissed Brad, and they started walking toward the plane. But then something unexpected happened. Marchetti's men didn't leave. Instead, they followed Veronica and Brad toward the aircraft. "This doesn't look right," Danny said. Through the telephoto lens, I watched one of Marchetti's men pull a gun. Veronica screamed. Brad raised his hands. "They're not partners," I realized. "They're cleaning up loose ends." Danny was already calling 911 when the first shot rang out across the airfield. The gunshot shattered the night air, but it wasn't aimed at Veronica or Brad. One of Marchetti's men had fired a warning shot into the air. "Get in the plane," I heard him shout across the tarmac. "Both of you. Now." Through the telephoto lens, I watched Veronica's face crumple with terror. Brad was arguing with the gunman, gesturing frantically at the briefcase. "They're not killing them," Danny observed. "They're taking them somewhere." "Why?" "Because dead people can't transfer stolen money out of offshore accounts." Danny's police contacts arrived within minutes, unmarked cars surrounding the airfield with practiced precision. I recognized the lead detective, Maria Santos, from news coverage of organized crime cases. "Rodriguez." She approached our car with surprise. "What are you doing here?" "Long story, Santos. But those people getting on that plane? They're connected to a federal case involving fraud and murder." "Murder?" I started to protest, but Danny silenced me with a look. As we watched, FBI agents, different ones than Roberts and Morrison, emerged from unmarked vans. "The real FBI," Danny explained later. "Not whoever had been feeding Veronica information." The takedown was swift and professional. Marchetti and his men were arrested at gunpoint. Veronica and Brad were pulled from the plane in handcuffs. The briefcase contained over $2 million in cash and USB drives full of financial records. Detective Santos interviewed us on the scene. When I showed her the evidence from Dad's hidden files and Danny's surveillance, her expression grew grim. "Ms. Blackwood, your father wasn't the target of this investigation. He was working with us." The truth hit me like a physical blow. Dad had been an FBI informant. 6 months ago, your father contacted us about irregularities in city contracting bids. He suspected corruption but needed help building a case. We've been investigating Marchetti's operation ever since. Then why did agents Roberts and Morrison tell me Dad was under investigation? Santos frowned. "There are no agents by those names in our Chicago office." Fake FBI agents. Veronica's scheme had been even more elaborate than I'd imagined. Back at the FBI field office, the real story emerged from hours of interrogation. Veronica hadn't just married Dad for his money, she'd been recruited by Marchetti's organization specifically to infiltrate Blackwood Construction. Dad's illness had accelerated their timeline. They needed to steal as much as possible before he died and the company passed to me. But Dad had figured it out, started cooperating with federal investigators, and changed his will to protect his legacy. The fake FBI investigation had been their last desperate attempt to seize control of Blackwood Construction before the real evidence came to light. "Your father saved detailed records of every fraudulent transaction," the lead investigator told me. "His cooperation will help us prosecute the entire network." But as I sat in that sterile conference room, watching Veronica being led away in shackles, I felt empty rather than vindicated. Dad had died carrying this burden alone, protecting his company and his daughter while pretending everything was normal. "There's something else," Detective Santos said gently. "The medical examiner wants to reopen the case into your father's death." My heart stopped. "What do you mean?" "The timeline of his decline doesn't match typical pancreatic cancer progression, given what we now know about Veronica's activities." The words hung in the air like poison. Had they killed him? Had my father been murdered while I sat helplessly in hospital waiting rooms, trusting the woman who might have been slowly poisoning him? As dawn broke over Chicago for the second time that week, I realized the will reading had been just the beginning. The real battle for Dad's legacy, and justice for his death, was about to begin. The exhumation order came through on a gray October morning, 6 weeks after the arrests. I stood in Graceland Cemetery, watching as Dad's casket was lifted from the ground he'd rested in for only 4 months. The medical examiner, Dr. Patricia Wong, had found irregularities in Dad's medical records that raised red flags. His oncologist, Dr. Stevens, had noted that Dad's rapid decline didn't match his treatment response. Most pancreatic cancer patients who responded as well as Dad had to chemotherapy lived months longer. "We're testing for a variety of substances," Dr. Wong explained to me in her sterile office. Heavy metals, exotic poisons, anything that could have accelerated his decline while mimicking natural progression. The waiting was agony. I threw myself into rebuilding Blackwood Construction, working 18-hour days to repair the damage to our reputation and relationships. Many clients had stayed loyal, but others needed convincing that the company's integrity remained intact. Henderson helped me navigate the legal complexities of Dad's estate while federal prosecutors built their case against Veronica, Brad, and Marchetti's organization. The financial crimes were clear-cut, but proving murder required scientific evidence. 2 weeks later, Dr. Wong called with results that made my hands shake. "Jovi, I'm sorry to tell you this, but your father was murdered. We found lethal levels of thallium in his tissue samples, a heavy metal poison that's virtually undetectable without specific testing." Thallium. Odorless, tasteless, and when administered in small doses over time, it mimics the symptoms of cancer treatment side effects. Nausea, fatigue, hair loss, organ failure. How long would this have taken? I asked. Based on the concentrations we found, someone was poisoning your father for at least 3 months before his death. 3 months. Right around the time Dad started acting suspicious of Veronica, when he began meeting secretly with Henderson and cooperating with the FBI. She'd been killing him slowly while pretending to care for him, while I held his hand during chemo sessions, while we all believed cancer was stealing him from us. The murder charges against Veronica were filed the next day. Her reaction, captured on jailhouse cameras, was exactly what I expected: complete denial, claims of innocence, accusations that the evidence was planted. But Brad broke first. Under pressure from prosecutors offering reduced sentences, he confessed to purchasing the thallium through dark web contacts. Veronica had researched the poison extensively, choosing it specifically because it would be mistaken for cancer progression. She said it was mercy, Brad told investigators, his recorded confession playing in a sterile FBI conference room. That Richard was suffering and this would end it quickly while securing their future together. Their future. Built on my father's murder. The trial lasted 3 months. I testified about Dad's final weeks, about the changes in his behavior as he grew suspicious, about the secret meetings and hushed phone calls. The prosecution painted a picture of systematic betrayal, financial fraud escalating to murder when discovery seemed inevitable. Veronica maintained her innocence to the end, claiming Brad had acted alone. But the evidence was overwhelming. Pharmacy records showed she'd researched thallium poisoning. Computer forensics revealed deleted browser histories about untraceable poisons. Financial records proved she'd been planning her escape long before Dad's death. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Guilty on all counts: first-degree murder, conspiracy, fraud, racketeering. As the judge read the sentence, life without parole, I felt no satisfaction. Dad was still gone. The months of suffering he'd endured, believing his body was betraying him when he was actually being murdered by someone he trusted, couldn't be undone. But his legacy was safe. Blackwood Construction would survive, would continue building the skyline he'd loved, would employ the hundreds of workers who depended on us. That evening, I sat in Dad's study for the last time as his daughter rather than his successor. Tomorrow, the company would officially transfer to my name. I would become the CEO of Blackwood Construction, carrying on what he'd built while ensuring it represented the values he'd actually lived by. In his desk drawer, I found one final envelope with my name on it, in Dad's handwriting. Inside was a letter dated 3 weeks before his death. "Jovi, if you're reading this, then the worst has happened and my suspicions were correct. I'm sorry you had to learn the truth this way. I tried to protect you from all of this, but I realize now that wasn't fair. You're stronger than I ever gave you credit for, and you'll be a better leader than I ever was. The company is yours now, not because of blood, but because you've earned it. Build something better than what I left behind. Make me proud. Dad." As Chicago's lights twinkled beyond the windows, I folded the letter carefully and placed it in my wallet. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new responsibilities, new chances to honor the man who died protecting his life's work. But tonight, I finally allowed myself to grieve, not just for the father I'd lost, but for the months of pain he'd endured believing he was dying naturally when he was actually being murdered by someone he trusted with his heart. 1 year later, I stood on the observation deck of the newest Blackwood construction project, a 40-story mixed-use tower that would house both luxury condos and affordable housing units. Dad would have loved the irony, a building that served everyone, not just the wealthy. The company had not only survived the scandal, but thrived. Our transparent response to the investigation, combined with the revelation that Dad had been the victim rather than the perpetrator, had actually strengthened client relationships. People respected integrity, and Dad's cooperation with federal investigators proved his character definitively. Marchetti's construction empire had crumbled under federal investigation. 18 people were indicted in the conspiracy, from city officials who'd accepted bribes to contractors who'd participated in bid rigging schemes. The corruption had run deeper than anyone imagined, but Dad's evidence had provided the foundation for cleaning it up. Brad received 25 years for his role in the murder and fraud. He'd testify against other co-conspirators in exchange for the possibility of parole in 15 years. I didn't care if he ever got out, Dad would still be gone. Veronica would die in prison. Her appeals had been denied, her claims of innocence dismissed by every court that reviewed the case. Sometimes I wondered if she ever felt remorse for what she'd done, but I'd stopped caring about her thoughts or feelings. The company employed over 3,000 people now, expanded into green construction and urban renewal projects. We'd established the Richard Blackwood Foundation, providing scholarships for children of construction workers and funding cancer research. But the real victory was smaller, more personal. Danny Rodriguez had come out of retirement to serve as our head of security. Henderson remained our legal counsel, though he'd started training a younger partner to eventually take over. Dr. Stevens, Dad's oncologist, had become a friend. He'd been haunted by his inability to save Dad until learning about the poisoning. Your father would be proud, Henderson told me as we reviewed quarterly reports in the conference room where this all began. Not just of the company's success, but of who you've become. I thought about that often. Dad had left me more than money or property. He'd left me the chance to prove myself worthy of his trust. Every ethical decision, every project that served the community, every time we chose integrity over profit, honored his memory more than any monument could. The FBI had recovered most of the stolen money from offshore accounts. Veronica and Brad had hidden millions in various schemes, but federal prosecutors had been relentless in tracking it down. The recovered funds had been invested back into the company, funding expansion and employee benefits. Justice hadn't brought Dad back, but it had prevented others from suffering similar betrayals. The investigation had exposed corruption throughout Chicago's construction industry, leading to reforms that protected honest businesses and workers. As I watched the sun set over the city Dad had helped build, I thought about that moment in Henderson's office when Veronica announced she was cutting me from the will. Her arrogance had been her downfall. If she'd stayed quiet, played the grieving widow, she might have gotten away with murder. Instead, her need to gloat had exposed the entire conspiracy. Dad's laughter in that conference room hadn't been coincidence, it had been justice. He'd known exactly what he was doing when he structured his will, when he gathered evidence, when he chose to protect his legacy through truth rather than silence. My phone buzzed with a text from the site foreman. The building's cornerstone was ready for the dedication ceremony. Engraved in the granite was a simple inscription, Richard Blackwood, builder of dreams, protector of truth. Tomorrow, we'd officially open the Blackwood Community Center on the building's ground floor, free meeting spaces for neighborhood groups, job training programs, after-school care for working parents. The kind of project Dad had always talked about but never had time to build. As I drove home through the streets Dad had traveled for 40 years, past buildings that bore his company's signature, I smiled thinking about how this story would end. Not with revenge or bitterness, but with construction, building something better on the foundation he'd left behind. The will had been just the beginning. Dad's real legacy wasn't what he'd left me, but what he'd taught me to build with it. And I was just getting started.